and welcome to Hort Talk, an HTA podcast. This is episode 13, and today we are talking about the complexities of peat. I am today joined by four very special guests, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves.
Hi there, I'm Mike Burks. I'm the Managing Director of the Gardens Group. We've got 3 garden centres in Somerset and Dorset. I'm also the immediate past chairman of the Garden Centre Association. I'm on the Industry Growing Media Task Force, and I'm on the board of the Responsible Sourcing Scheme.
I'm Natalie Porter. I run a bedding plant nursery called Happy Plants in the Northwest. I'm also a co-founder and president of the Young People in Horticulture Association.
Hi, I'm Ben Malin. I'm managing director of Godwins. We're a 6th generation family business manufacturing compost. I'm also a director of the Responsible Sourcing Scheme and on the Growing Media Task Force.
Hello, I'm David Lydiat. I'm the Public Affairs and Policy Manager at the Horticultural Trades Association.
Thank you all very much for agreeing to be our guests today. So we are talking about peat. So let's start with a big question. What is this big complex issue of peat and surrounding peat? What's going on?
Well, the peat is being banned, and we've known that would be happening for quite some time. But now it is a formal ban coming into place for use in amateur gardening by the end of this Parliament, which sounds like it should be the end of 2024. And then further on, a ban for use completely for growers of all types, with a few exceptions, which will start cutting in 2026 and in 2030. And it's all the challenges for us in getting to grips with that, and how we position ourselves and get used to using completely new materials, almost all of which are not quite as good as peat were.
I think it's worth thinking about how we got here with peat to start with. Peat has been harvested and used as a burning fuel for many centuries, and that really only changed with the Second World War and the John Innes formula and what they called soil-less growing media after the war, where they used peat instead of traditional loam and sand-based composts. And then through the 60s and 70s, the industry massively expanded on the back of peat-based growing media, compost, grow bags that you bought in the garden centres and DIY stores, and the industry was hugely reliant on peat. But since the 1980s, we've been working on peat reduction, and the level of reduction now is enormous compared to where we started this exercise, and we've come an awfully long way. The important thing for us as an industry and why we've used peat is it's stable, it's consistent, it's relatively light, it's inert, and it has what they call good cation exchange capacity, which in layman's terms means that it holds on to fertilizer that we add to it and lets it out when the plant requires it. And that material being available has driven the huge expansion in horticulture we've seen, particularly from the 70s onwards. And that is why peat was important to us, because it enabled the industry to expand massively. And that is why those technical characteristics of peat are why it is hard for us to replace peat. We've replaced the easiest element to replace. We're now on to replacing the hardest element, because it has to be replaced with materials of high quality. And that's a particular challenge for professional horticulture.
So before we talk about what we're replacing it with, why are we being asked to reduce peat? What is the reasoning behind the government putting this initiative into place?
Initially, when peat first became under environmental pressure in the 1980s, it was owing to habitat damage. The environmental groups were pointing towards large expanses of open peat surface where the vegetation had been stripped, bogs were being drained, and there was a lot of focus on the loss of wetland peatland habitat and the loss of peat accumulating vegetation on the surface. The industry did a lot of work on restoration, working damaged bogs and restoring them to peat forming habitats. The issue now is much more around the carbon sink. Peat is a store of carbon. As a peat bog grows the surface layer, be that moss peat or sedge peat, takes in carbon and accumulates it and stores it. So draining peat and harvesting peat emits carbon. And the reason now why this has got as far as legislative action, potentially by government, is because of the carbon requirements and the carbon targets. But we need to look at things in the round, because of course everything has a carbon footprint. But that is the reason why peat is in the legislative focus of government at the moment.
And compared to other industries, is that significant, the amount of carbon that's reduced by peat harvesting?
The actual level of carbon emitted by peat harvesting, and peat use is a better way to put it, because we're using peat that's either harvested in the UK or imported, is frankly minuscule compared to many other industries. It's very hard to understand on the basis of the actual carbon emissions alone why this is such a focus, but it's the background, it's the history of it, and it's the long history of pressure on the industry that is the reason why we're in this position now, and why we have been striving for years to reduce peat use.
So if we go back to what Mike said originally, the government's original ambition was to become peat-free by 2030, although that now looks like it will be the end of 2026. What impact does this ban have on the industry, your businesses moving forward?
Absolutely enormous. Like, on the industry, the amount of certainly perennials that are imported at the moment, the changes it will make within our own business. One of the main changes, as Ben says, it will be very difficult to find something that performs in the same ways. So there's an entire re-education of the customer. I think there's also, we're on the back foot with that because of the past few years, especially through the pandemic. Anything that was brown that you shredded and put in a bag could be described as peat-free compost. And there's been this demonization of peat-free compost with amateur and hobby gardeners already. So anything that says peat-free on now, they're extremely skeptical at the offset. But even if we can produce a really, really good alternative, they're still going to need to use it differently. It's just, there's so many nuances to it. The weight of the material implicating the amount of plants that we can put on each wagon, so using more wagons, you could go on and on and on with the intricacies of the change. A big one for me is this comment that we get a lot, that we've known this was coming. We've known about it for a long time, so why haven't we fixed it? Just to sort of counteract that point that gets thrown at us a lot, is we've known this is a problem for a long time, doesn't mean that the science has allowed us, or the accessibility and availability of resources should have allowed us to fix it by now. It's not the case that the industry isn't wanting to make the change. It's just that the rate of pace of the change needs to be dictated by the science, by the availability, the scalability, and the true sustainability of the alternatives, because there's a lot of wolf in sheep's clothing out there as well.
I think that's a really good point about the amount of work the industry's done, which I think we often don't get credit for. We've done a huge amount of work on peat reduction, and we've made a huge amount of progress. The issue now is the quality of the materials that we can source. Can we make a good, high quality peat-free compost? Yes. Can we get enough of the high quality raw materials needed to do that? No. And that's fundamentally the issue. And the 2026 target, or legislative date, is hugely problematic for manufacturers, because we're attempting to change in both in the amateur market and the professional market on the same timescale. Because the plants that we grow, and I should have said at the start that we're not only manufacturers, we're also growers. We have a nursery that grows hardy nursery stock. And the plants we plant in 2024 will be sold, some of them in 2026 and beyond. So we're trying to change the amateur and retail, and amateur sector and the professional sectors simultaneously. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And it's incredibly risky for professional horticulture.
I think in the garden centre, and also when I'm out speaking to garden clubs, the going peat-free is a huge issue, and it's it's tough enough for commercial growers to do it, but actually the amateur gardener is obviously having to get used to learning new skills in order to be successful in gardening, and that's one of my big worries. And I think both Ben and Nat have mentioned that. We can provide lots of training and guidance and advice, and we've got a small nursery where we are peat free, so we're learning very quickly from that and can pass that on. But the danger that I think we face is that as Nat said, there was the skepticism about the quality of materials that were available maybe 15, 20 years ago as peat-free alternatives. We've now got better materials available, and our gardeners are being weaned off peat onto these materials. But the problem we face is that with commercial growers then needing those same materials much earlier than was anticipated, the knock-on effect is that actually amateur gardeners are then going to have lesser quality products available. And so any of the learning that they do now on the high quality materials will all have to happen again on the newer materials, because they just won't be the same. So we can train all we like, but actually next year or 2 years' time, unless something changes in terms of the availability of the quality materials, they're going to come across similar problems they have now, which is, how do we use these materials? How do we feed them? How do we water them? Why aren't they lasting from year to year in a permanent planting, which is one of the dangers? And the knock-on effect environmentally of that is huge. I mean, fundamentally, I think the more people you get gardening, the more people who understand what is going on with the climate, and therefore the more people who will want to do something about it. So we've got to keep people gardening, and I think that's one of those issues. And then you get the cost issues. The cost will go up, and that impacts on those who are least able to afford it. One of the greatest things about gardening is that it's not a rich person's occupation. It can be carried out by every member of society, whether you've got a windowsill, a balcony, a patio, an allotment, or a 15-acre garden. You're doing the same things, and it's a wonderful leveler from that point of view as well. And that, I worry about that enormously.
I was going to make a couple of points, Mike. From the outset, I should say that it is actually the industry's ambition to go peat-free, and we have, as Ben pointed out, made great strides in transitioning away, particularly in the last few years. So we've gone to a historic low of 16.8% in bagged growing media or compost in garden centres now, and that's going to be phased out perhaps over the next 18 months. We're below 50% peat use for our professional tree and plant growers now for the first time, which is fantastic. So we have come a long way. But I think there's a lot of challenges to businesses, and on the visits I've made recently to HTA members, it's clear that number one, there's not enough peat-free alternatives out there at the scale to be able to grow what they need to grow. That's a fact. Whether it's wood fibre, coir, or even some of the mid to long-term alternatives, maybe green waste or sphagnum moss or bracken, which need to be looked at as a long-term view and strategy. The new deadline that DEFRA have set at 2026, bringing it forward 4 years, means that we won't get there in time for a lot of businesses. And these are businesses also that I visited that have already started the peat-free journey and are continuing to conduct trials to be able to get there. Because of the seasonality of horticulture, that's not straightforward. So by reducing it for 4 years from the 2030 deadline, which DEFRA suggested early on for our professional growers, to 2026, that's 4 years worth of trials gone, basically, which makes things extremely difficult. On top of that, as Mike just been pointing out, is the learning as well. So, for example, learning how that certain peat-free mixes need more water because the water retention isn't there, need more feed and more regular feed because it doesn't hold in those nutrients. And I know that bottom line figure, the investment having to be put on there, is north of 20%. And moreover, when you're trialing these peat-free alternatives, there's also been a loss of, I've been told around 20% as well. So these are loss of plants that haven't survived because they're not in as good a quality growing media. So huge pressures on horticulture businesses, professional growers, to be able to produce at the quality and quantity that we currently at, which I think, it needs to be realised by those outside of the horticulture industry, because I think the problem we've got, and as Ben was saying about the background to this, is that it's become a very political issue. I think that the thought of, peat bad, everything else good, is a dangerous one without understanding the intricacies and the complexities of going peat free, because if you were to rush that process, it would be deeply damaging to the horticulture industry, who provide huge amounts of biodiversity, by the way, in the trees and plants that it produces.
So that thing about us committed as an industry, I think is exactly right. And if you take, as in our the range that we of growing media we have available for customers, we are now more than 95% peat free. I think we're not unusual with that. Many garden centres are aiming to be peat free in their bag product by the end of this year, so a whole year earlier than otherwise. So I think there's commitment there, but the goalposts have moved, haven't they? And actually, the 2026 is just too soon. And if we're going to get there, and
Mike, they're absolutely right. The commitment is there from the manufacturers. The commitment is there. We're not ideologically wedded to the use of peat at all.
No.
We don't mind what we put in a bag so long as it grows.
Yeah,
it must do the job. It's got to work. And I was fairly comfortable with 2024 and 2030. Yeah. 2024 was hard, but I gained comfort knowing that we could pull peat-free, the best peat-frees out of the professional sector and use them in the amateur sector, knowing that we could still use peat until 2030. The issue is with 2024 and 2026, that the quality material simply doesn't exist. And I think it's worth just saying something about what the issues are with peat-free, because we can make a very good peat-free compost, but we require 30%-ish of a really quality material to replace peat. And fundamentally, that means coir or composted bark. And coir, there are supply issues. It comes from the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka. There's quite a long supply chain. We can get it, but there are questions about long-term availability that are yet to be answered. Composted bark is very tough because nobody cuts trees down for the bark. There's a finite supply of that material. Beyond that, we're talking about wood-based products, composted green waste, and these are fine as elements in a retail mix. But the issue we have is that these products are active. They're not a stable product in the way that a peat-based product was. These have microbes in them, which are active. They're activated by the manufacturing process. You walk through the factory and you can see the steam coming off these products where they're hot. That activation activates the microbes and they start to consume the fertilizer. And what that means is we get a risk of nitrogen lockup, and we can overcome that with an increased fertilizer dose. But that obviously has a cost implication, and it has a management implication for the consumer growing it or the professional grower. And
an environmental consideration.
Well, I was going to say that.
Sorry.
I absolutely. I feel in many ways that we've never been less green. We used to take peat from next to our factory and combine it with a certain amount of fertilizer and put it in a bag and send it up the road. We now take raw materials from all over the country and indeed the world, and we reconstitute coir, or we process wood using diesel-based machinery. We then put 3 times as much fertilizer in, which is oil-based, and it frustrates me endlessly, this. I'm not arguing against phasing out and stopping the use of peat. I'm just pointing out some of the unmentioned implications.
I think it's important to acknowledge that UK nurseries aren't like on the continent as well. On the continent, a lot of nurseries are monocropped. You could get one peat-based, peat-free solution, one recipe that works for you, and as long as the bales are consistent, you know, that works across the board. But we, for example, would have 60 different products at the moment, probably 20 different genus in several different formats, and to find 60 different solutions with 4 years less than we thought we had is going to be nigh on impossible. We're going to have to completely reprogram our infrastructure in terms of how we get substrates, because we have an overhead line which distributes the same substrate to each machine, which works with peat. But without peat, we're going to have to hand feed different machines, which is our problem, but worth acknowledging. I think when we talk about the benefits of
and the watering machine,
water is going to be horrendous. And I think when we talk about coir as well, you know, I'm learning that there are more sustainable versions of coir or roots to coir than we used to have. And I'm grateful for that. But we are so far down the queue for coir. When you look at soft fruit and the amount of coir that they need, I know they're saying that there might be enough available, but soft fruit are always going to take priority over ornamentals because it's the food chain. But I think when we talk about the values of horticulture, it's not just financial, it's not just environmental. I saw a documentary on the BBC that said in London alone, gardens and green spaces save £300 million per annum in avoided health costs. And when we talk, I think Mike mentioned before about how important it is that that customer who's that little bit closer to the poverty line still has access to that pick-me-up plant. And we are it's essentially going to be producing an inferior product for a higher price point. As we've all said, we know we need to move away from peat, but doing that any faster than is sensible could risk collapsing an industry that contributes billions to the economy and uncountless amounts to people's mental health. And when we look at the future of, you know, climate change, if you've got a flooding problem, plant more trees. If you've got an overheating problem, plant more trees. You've got a carbon problem, horticulture's got the solution there. So mental health, climate change, massive global issues. The investment needed is in horticulture to combat those issues. And if we produce an inferior product and make people think that they're crap at gardening, we're going to lose a lot of interest from a lot of people who could be the future of saving or mitigating these huge issues. So it's enormous.
Water's a key issue. Now, water's a really key issue because a peat-free compost requires a different mindset on watering. For the amateur guy, you need to scratch the surface. The top dries out, but it can still be wet underneath. It's very easy to keep watering and wash your fertilizer through. The professional sector is going to have to look really hard at water. We, in our nursery, have spray irrigation from above, which is great with peat. In a peat-free world, we're going to have to look at capillary action from below, but you're still going to need the spray irrigation because capillary action doesn't save your stock on a climate change hot day in August. So there's a duplication of cost for the industry that isn't being considered.
Yeah, that would be enormous. We've just built a new nursery at an enormous cost that is spray irrigation, but it's MyPet, so the options for watering from underneath are minimal. And as I say, all our compost infrastructure is built so that we can distribute the same substrate to each machine. And these are costs we're going to have to face, and we will do it. But with the margins that we operate on, the amount of businesses that will just say, no, I'm not doing it, tap out on it, I think will be more than anticipated. And especially because the ban is looking at imports as well. The amount of lavender, for example, coming in off the continent is enormous. And a UK nursery is going to be able to replace that demand? Yeah. If not, so, I would worry for garden centres, Mike.
No, they're not.
It's a really key point. This ban on imports is a really key point because over 90% of our growing members import something for their operation from and largely from the continent of the likes of the Netherlands. Europe are far behind the UK in looking at peat for a ban, and therefore their supply of products, typically smaller, younger products, will not be peat free, and therefore are likely to be banned at this 2026 date. That would be hugely detrimental to UK growers, and will undoubtedly see a restriction in the market, what can and can't be grown here in the thousands of species and plant types available. And it may well see empty shelves in garden centres and plant rationing as a result.
I think there is a lack of understanding from DEFRA as to how much is imported. I mean, we discovered that from the plant health challenges of a couple of years ago as to how many inspectors were needed for plant stock coming in. I'm all in favour of British grown stock. That's what we sell in the main, but obviously we import too. But the challenge, then the pressures again on the whole chain of Europe going peat free, because they won't want to have a mixture of peat based and peat free in the nursery. That just gets very, very difficult. So that will again put further pressure on and again knocking the end user, the amateur gardener, stopping them gardening. And you know, we go back to Nat's point about the health benefits. You know, in COVID, gardening was an absolute saviour of big chunks of society stuck at home. 3.5 million new gardeners, because they found something really useful to do that was filled up their time, great for their physical health. We all know how good it is for your mental health, but also it's environmentally a positive thing to do as well. And that's the thin ice that we are travelling across at the moment. If this is brought in too quickly, and those high quality materials.
Let me put some numbers on that for you. In our case, of our turnover, we import probably 30% per year of our sales turnover. The plants are imported, and we take them in the autumn and we pot them on, and then we'll sell them through the year. Our suppliers are simply not set up. Our suppliers in the Netherlands and France are not set up to supply peat-free by 2026. And we will not be able to source that 30%. And in the current timescale and in the current availability of material, we will not be able to replace that by our own propagation. So that has an immediate impact on what we can sell and what is available to the market. And that's just us. That's just one nursery. And I'm sure everybody else will be in exactly the same position.
So the HTA, yeah, just to highlight that, absolutely. The HTA has done some number crunching. And if the ban date for professional growers goes from 2030 to 2026, that will mean the sector in the UK will likely produce around 100 million less trees and plants in 2027. Okay, but the saving on the peatlands would be the equivalent of the carbon dioxide absorbed by 500,000 trees in that time. So even looking at it logically for bringing that date forward 4 years, it doesn't stack up at all for the carbon absorption quality. So not only are we damaging a green UK industry, which provides so much to so many people, supports nearly 700,000 jobs across the UK, contributes 6.3 billion plus to the Treasury every year in tax revenue, but actually, if you take the number of trees lost compared to what you'll save from the peatlands in that 4-year period, it doesn't stack up. So what the HTA is sort of saying is, it was hoping that DEFRA will, and the wider government, and including the Scottish government, will listen to these arguments and work closely and carefully with the industry to be able to to do a genuine sustainable roadmap to transition to 100% peat-free in 2030. And we've seen a number of questions from MPs who we've been speaking to recently in the House of Parliament, Wendy Chamberlain MP, Peter Dowd MP, who've been asking some really good questions of DEFRA and talking with them about, where's this supply going to come from of peat-free alternatives. And the DEFRA ministers have promised to meet with the HTA. Otherwise, if the narrative is quite simply, we've got to end using peat tomorrow, as perhaps some NGOs would have people believe, that's deeply damaging and dangerous actually to all the benefits of the gardening industry in the UK. We
as an industry need to pull together from a PR point of view on two things. One, trying to get a way that people read past the NGO headline. And I think we also need a PR campaign on re-educating the consumer. And I think this is something the industry needs to pull together on, and almost have they have the wool board for wool. We almost need like an entity that can promote and share the virtues of what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve, and why it's so important we're allowed the time.
But let's just have a quick discussion about the alternatives to peat then. So we've talked about why we want to reduce peat. As an industry, we are behind that. But looking at these alternatives to peat, actually from a sustainability point of view, importing them from the other side of the world, the increase in water and fertilizer, let's talk about the balance of that and the reduction in peat, and how we're actually going to still continue on that journey as a sustainable industry, but reduce the amount of peat that we use.
Well, this, I think, is where the time is really important, because there are some potential materials out there, but they need a lot more time to work out whether they're good. I mean, digestates from biogas plants, but huge challenges with those, and they can be used partially, my understanding, as a sort of a filler in some compost. But there's huge challenges with getting them to be used as a complete alternative to peat. There's green waste as well. I've got a bag that was just been dumped on my desk this morning, which is a Koya green waste mix, but it's also full of shreddings of plastic, and so there's huge issues there with councils making sure that the green waste we're getting is green waste, and not just half of someone's rubbish bin as well. And that's going to take quite a bit of legislation to clean all that up, and then time to get the trialling done properly. And my huge worry is how quickly some of these materials are being decided that they could be an alternative without the proper trial times to get them properly and consistently in the market.
Fundamentally, we need stable quality material.
And
consistent. And in the amateur sector, we can use, and we are using, some of these other materials as filler in an amateur compost. And we have to accept that there will be a degree of variability, and so-and-so may lose their tomatoes, or their broad beans may not germinate this year. That is simply where we will be with these other materials. There is a role for green compost. There is a role potentially for digestate, although I have some profound concerns about the stability of that product. There is a role for wood-based products, although there is a technical limit to it. But am I going to grow professionally in green compost, high green compost content mixes, or any green compost content? No. Am I going to put digestate in a professional compost? Absolutely not. As I've said, we can make a very good peat-free compost, and many members of the industry are. The question is not, can we do it? The question is, can we get enough materials to do it consistently? And within the current timescale, no. And that is not me being difficult about wanting to continue to use peat. That's simply me being realistic about what is available in the marketplace at the moment.
The pandemic showed that when the supply chain is stretched, it undermines the quality of the material put out there, which undermines the public trust in the product.
I think that's absolutely right. And we all know that we were absolutely stretched beyond the limit during the pandemic, and we just could not get hold of the raw materials we needed to, and less good quality materials were being bagged than we would have liked. But I can already see this year, because peat-free is so much bigger part of the market, and the market is doing this job, but peat-free is so much bigger part of the market that raw material supply is under pressure. And we've got, as matters stand for the retail sector, we've got one more year. And if the professional sector ban were 2026, and we're having to supply professional growers with compost that they're growing in to sell from that point onwards, then I truly believe there will be a shortage of material in the marketplace. I do not believe it is possible for the market to cope.
And then again, with that, and us trying to help our amateur gardeners to garden, is that generally, going back to peat-based compost, you could give the same advice no matter what the brand was. but now you're giving advice about 20 different mixes that all need slightly different or sometimes considerably different treatment.
But also through the season, Mike, you know, your material varies. The same material is not the same material between January and June.
No,
we even see it in the same batch. We've had bales in the same batch that have performed completely differently. I think part of that's the infrastructure coming into play at the manufacturers, but that's why I shouted the word consistency out before, because if we're on a level playing field and we know what we're dealing with, we can deal with it. But at the moment, every bag you open, whether it's 1 week or the next, or even in the same batch, is a different ball game.
It is, and I guess with the green waste is, you know, green waste that's collected at this time of year will be very different to green waste that's collected in October, November. So therefore, and it comes into the chain at different times. So therefore, it's just not the same thing.
We are attempting to further mature and mix our products before they're bagged. We don't just have them in and bag them. If we can help it, we try and hold them. But I think what you need to think about as well, which isn't often thought about, is the manufacturing infrastructure implications of this. We used to have a big pile of peat, which we bulldozed, and we used to bulldoze it into a big pile in the autumn, and we used to take that peat out of that pile and bag it, and it was the same. What you now need is a much bigger footprint of area, because storing peat-free is space hungry. You can't build big piles of it because it catches fire. You have to keep turning it. It operates differently through the factory, it has different flow characteristics. We bag materially slower on peat-free. And the other thing, because it's active, you simply can't follow the old model where come October and November, you would start bagging and you would lay that stock down and it would be peat, but high peat content compost, and it would still grow April, May, June, no problem at all. We have to manufacture on a much more just-in-time basis. And it puts a huge amount of pressure on the manufacturing infrastructure. It's not simply a case of, well, why haven't you stopped using peat then? There's all these different reasons for it. And as I say, I don't want anybody to think that we're not committed to eliminating peat. We are. The timescale is the problem.
Yeah, Ben, you're not just talking about R&D there, you're talking about supply chains as well, which of course takes a long time to establish, to be able to supply that. So
and they're erratic, and we're competing with, for wood products, for example, we're competing with the biomass industry, which is subsidized. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there is a finite amount of material out there that different industries and different countries, frankly, are competing for. Yeah.
And so, Ben, would you welcome, and you, Nat, would you welcome support from the government in regards to grants for trialling peat-free in the future with the different mixes and where it could go and establishing these supply chains?
There absolutely has to be. In the machinery required to make the change as well. You know, as I say, nursery is a low margin industry, and we can't make these. You know, if we had to get a new transplanting machine, for example, we'd be looking at £250,000 just to change a machine to deal with a rougher substrate, which is effectively what we're going to get. You know, there's millions and millions of pounds on any nursery that you would have to put into, and we can make, you know, we're not afraid of investing, but we need to be allowed the time or offered the support to make those changes, because they are completely game changing, and we want to do them. And I know we keep saying that, but we really, really do want to move away from peat, but it has to happen at a sustainable speed, and it has to be with a realistic alternative that is tested and we know isn't just out of the frying pan into the fire. So
do you think as an industry we're actually being penalised a little bit here for being environmental horticulture? Because if this was just being grown in food, or this was pharmaceuticals or something, we would have to have a much longer research and development period. We'd have to trial it. Do you think that actually as an industry we should be given the same considerations as a lot of others would?
I would argue that it is medicine, you know, not in the you're going to ingest it kind of way most of the time, but in the mental health and the physical health benefits. It's prescribed by the NHS. You know, horticulture and green spaces are prescribed by the NHS, and yeah, the pecking order for our access to these materials, as Mike and Ben have alluded to, doesn't take into consideration the enormous role that what we do plays in the country's well-being.
And if this was pharmaceuticals that we were manufacturing and we were using peat in it, it would be regarded as essential. And a different view would be taken, and they would say this is essential. The carbon emissions that come from that are tiny in comparison to other sectors like transport, and therefore it is not a key target for reduction. But because it is not viewed as essential by government, it's and by maybe society as a whole, maybe it's undervalued horticulture. But because of that, there is extra pressure on this industry that we're not seeing on transport, for example. And can I return to the point that Nat was making about investment? For example, if we're going to replace stock bought in from the continent, then there is an investment cycle around extra propagation capacity, infrastructure, extra staff that we need to invest in to do that. And that simply cannot be done in the timescale. And when you are trialing peat-free mixes, because of growing seasons, you can only have so many trials in a season. You get maybe 2, maybe 3, depends on when you start and finish and what you're trying to achieve. But you can't force this all year. You have to work with the seasons. And I really can't stress enough that we are committed to doing this. And I thought 2030 was a fair timescale to do it in.
Yeah.
I absolutely do not think 2026 is remotely fair or realistic.
No, my view was 2030 is challenging, but we'd find a way.
Yeah.
2026 is, oh my God, because the knock-on effect in both directions. So by 2026, 2024, we will have sorted out the amateur gardening bit. And, you know, we're already there, way ahead of the game on that. I think you look at the numbers, you know, the amount of peat being sold now is tiny by comparison to 2 years ago. So it's happening already.
But that 30% in a bag or 20% or whatever it is makes a huge difference because it makes that compost grow. And you've got to replace it with something that isn't available, frankly, at the moment. And, you know, what we really need is 2024 to happen, a couple of years to see what happens from that, the government to be able to look at the impact, and us as an industry to look at the impact on not just sales, but on actual performance out there in the marketplace, and then to be able to look at 2030 for the professional sector, to try and do them, but it's experimenting with professional horticulture, which is just wrong.
There's no two ways about it that we will lose our range of plants from this. We will lose key components in a range of plants, you know, things like we're really struggling with Calibrachoa, even at 60% reduced. Marguerites are another, you know, there's key stalwart plants that will be lost from the market because of this. And if that's a consequence that has to happen, it has to happen. But if we had a bit longer, might we be able to?
Ericaceous is in real trouble because there is ericaceous peat-free compost available, but it is a tiny amount. And the whole ericaceous sector is potentially in trouble because the consumer will not be able to buy a suitable compost or enough suitable compost to grow it in.
Yeah, this is a key point because it's absolutely the acidity sort of loving plants, and also one we haven't mentioned is house plants as well. You know, which is more popular than ever, and this will be a big knock-on effect. But certainly rhododendrons, you know, azaleas, those types of plants will struggle without peat at the moment.
Houseplants is an introductory thing as well. It introduces people to horticulture, and you take that away and you start to lose people going into gardening at all.
And it's the same point. We can make a good peat-free houseplant compost. We just can't make enough of it. And actually the professional sector begins to lose their customers if people buy things that then die.
Yeah.
And we can prop them up to the point of dispatch. I'm fairly confident that, you know, with the resources and this team that we have here, we can prop up a plant so that it looks nearly as good on the shelf. But we're doing the same as you, Ben. We're loading everything with control release. Even the plants we're producing for the cheaper markets are loaded with control release to give people a chance. But the long and short of it is they're going to not get the garden performance that they're expecting, and they're probably going to blame themselves.
So in summary, as an industry, we are highly committed to this target that the government has put on us. We want to reduce the amount of peat, but we want to do it properly. We want to make sure what we're replacing it with is right, is best for us as an industry, as businesses throughout the supply chain, and for the end consumer as well. And that requires time, money, support, and communication, both back up towards the government, DEFRA, and also down to the end consumer, so that everyone is fully aware of really what's involved and what the changes need to be.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that commitment is throughout the industry, and we've come an awfully long way. But the rushing now has the risk of undermining a lot of that progress.
3 words, Alex: time and availability. I think that's the key, and both of them are largely in DEFRA's gift and Scottish Government's gift as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for agreeing to be our guests today on Hort Talk. You've been listening to Hort Talk episode 13, an HTA podcast. I look forward to welcoming you on the next episode, which is being recorded live from the National Plants Show in June. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.